Everyone for joining us today. We have a really exciting presentation this week. Two speakers, Ben and Janiece are joining us from Fresh Energy, and we're getting kind of a different kind of presentation today, more from the world of policy and public engagement, which I think is awesome for kind of academic type folks to sort of stay engaged in. So Ben Passer is Director of Energy Access and Equity with Fresh Energy, and he directs their work to advance equitable outcomes across Minnesota's energy system and also supports the organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. He joined Fresh Energy as a policy associate in May 2015, and his previous experience includes legal clerkships with the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Honeywell International, and internships with Governor Mark Dayton and Senator John Marty. Ben holds a BA in political science from the University of Minnesota and a Juris Doctor from William Mitchell College of Law. And he's a member of the Minnesota Bar. Janiece Watts is a senior policy associate from the Energy Access and Equity Program, and she plays a key role in working to advance equitable outcomes across Minnesota's energy system. Her current projects include the St. Paul Property Dweller Property Owner Energy Project, a unique joint partnership with Community Stabilization Project, and also collaborative work with environmental justice groups to improve air quality and reduce demand for oil through electrification of transportation. Janiece joined Fresh Energy in August 2018, and before that, she worked as a community engagement manager for Eureka Recycling, where she developed strategies on zero waste and environmental justice. She is an established organizer working for racial and environmental justice through outreach events, community meetings, and political action in the Twin Cities for over 10 years. She got her BA in political science and environmental science policy and management from the University of Minnesota, and she's a board member of Headwaters Foundation for Justice and MN 350. So thanks very much, Janiece and Ben, for joining us today, and I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you, David, for these great intros and for inviting us to be part of your seminar here at our alma mater, place where we went to school. So thank you. Our presentation and our discussion today is on how renewable energy policy can follow the lead of environmental justice activism. We've been, over the last 2 years that our program has been at Fresh Energy, we've just really been trying to think about deeply and work deeply on integrating energy policy and into social equity, environmental justice, and really putting that lens to our work. So this is kind of a overview of how we've been able to do that. And of course, it's a journey. So it's not something that to say that we've reached the destination or we have achieved something and accomplished it in the study is done. It's all a work in progress, but we hope that it'll will give you some inspiration and some ideas about how to take that into your own work. So thanks for having us. We'll go on to the next slide.
Great. So hi, everyone. I'm Ben Passer, and I direct the Energy Access and Equity Program at Fresh Energy, as David said. Thank you for the introductions, David. So Janiece and I will talk a little bit more about ourselves individually and kind of what brought us to Fresh Energy in a little bit. But just wanted to give a quick overview of who Fresh Energy is as an organization. So we're an independent energy policy nonprofit. We're based in St. Paul. Of course, we're all working from home right now due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but all of our work really occurs in a variety of spaces. We work a lot at the state legislature, at the Public Utilities Commission, and other state agencies. We work at the local level with city officials and local governments, local agencies like the Metropolitan Council. And we also work collaboratively with stakeholders. So we work a lot with utilities, we work with community-based organizations and others. And really our mission is to shape and drive visionary energy policy that benefits all. And we'll talk a little bit later about that mission being updated, which we're excited to announce later this year. But really all of our work is around shaping and driving a clean energy future for all Minnesotans. So on the next slide, I think we'll talk a little bit more about that. Really just kind of, again, where we work, but our team is pretty diverse in terms of our skill sets. And I'm excited, especially to dig into this conversation with Janiece today. Really, I think both in terms of, kind of the different expertise that we bring to our work, but just, I think how our perspective on, the evidence, the data that we bring to our work, how that has evolved over time as well. So really excited to just kind of dig into that. But I think this slide hopefully shows a little bit further, how and where we do our work as an energy policy nonprofit.
Then moving on to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so again, so our program is the Energy Access and Equity Program. Ben and I are like the team for that, but Fresh Energy has several different teams, but we get to work, again, I think as Ben was describing, across the organization. So this work is not just concentrated to the two of us. It is really a collaborative effort across our whole organization, and with certainly from our programmatic work to the even the administrative side of nonprofit management that is included there. And so we really are, again, working to integrate equity deeply into all aspects of the organization, and in hopes that that actually expands out to the larger environmental and energy nonprofit community. Yes, okay. So you can go to the next slide. So there we are. This is the area. This is us. I guess I'll start by just sharing a bit about how I came to Fresh Energy, and then Ben can do the same. So like my intro described in a lot of words, I really like to say that I've had a lot of jobs within both, again, kind of traditional environmental nonprofit management, kind of like community, that kind of area of work, but then also within organizing, where it's a lot more interconnected and a lot more like in depth of kind of how different issues interact with each other, and what role does our human identities play in that. So I've kind of toggled in between really trying to find environmental justice as that center of my work. But when I started out, frankly, at the U of M, when I was studying for my degree, it was really difficult for me to find environmental justice as part of a curriculum, as part of coursework. Maybe some of you all know that there's been a real push to get environmental justice, I think a minor. It would be great to see it as a major, but to get environmental justice minor at the U of M over the last few years. When I graduated in 2012, I would have loved to have had that as my major, but I had to, in order to kind of find that connection between environmental studies, I had to look towards political science, largely history and cultural studies, and like that sort of realm to find where these things, where environment interacts with social justice, because that's what I was really looking for. And it didn't really find that cross section within my work until only just a few years ago. I've always kind of had a lot of volunteer gigs, so I've always, of course, was looking for a paying job in organizing. But if any of you aren't familiar, that it's not exactly a really well-paying gig on a lot of organizing jobs, which is really unfortunate, because it is again, really working from that intersection of how are humans impacted by the environment? How are we looking at it, not just from a lot of the, I think, traditional way of viewing the environment, which is like conservation or preservation or kind of like forestry management kind of professions. I was really looking for the intersection of health, particularly public health, of gender studies and racial issues, of social movements, looking for that interplay together, so that I can start to really understand, well, how do we get to policies and laws and regulations? How do we get these things crafted that are largely, in my view, rather narrow and misguided, and at worst can be really traumatic and perpetuate environmental racism and environmental injustice. And so that's really what guided my journey to find, certainly to come to Fresh Energy, to be able to find a place to put these things together of really examining how equity and environmental justice shows up in our environmental and energy policy. And I think it's a reckoning that the movement as a whole, I would say, both statewide, like for Minnesota, but also nationally, and I imagine internationally as well, of finally having this recognition that environmental justice is the lens that that the large environmental movement has needed to take. And it's always been there, of course, environmental justice, social movements. It is the driving engine where we actually, in my view, see change. And so policy and law need to, in my view, need to like take note, take notice, right, of what people who are most directly impacted, people who are on the front lines, are pushing for the solutions that are needed to solve our climate crisis. And within that, like we also have this crisis of white supremacy, of poverty, of capitalism, of patriarchy, right? We are living in a lot of different forms, with a lot of different forms of oppression. And we are at a moment I think, in our kind of human timeline that like it is time to address these things comprehensively and all together. And so, not that I have all the answers for that, but but that is my driving motivation and my passion to bring this work in, and to expand it for greater like Minnesota environmental justice movement. And it's really been wonderful to see an organization like Fresh Energy that's been around for a good while, to really take this to heart, again, not just between Ben and I's program, but for our organization as a whole. So, long way of saying that's part of my journey was seeking the sweet spot of where policy meets environmental justice organizing. And I get to do that work every day now. So I'll pause there and let Ben talk about his journey.
Yeah, thanks, Janiece. Yeah, I think that's really, really well said. I'll just start by saying, I think my journey has been very different from Janiece's, and just kind of how I came into this work. I was a political science major at the U of M. As a college student, I was really fascinated with, maybe less so now, fascinated with American politics, and really saw myself working in politics in some form or fashion. I think near the end of school, I was really looking at either teaching or law school as kind of the next step for me. And I just took a year off to work and to figure that out. Ended up working in a small family law firm, and then after that year off, ended up going back to law school at William Mitchell here in St. Paul. I think during law school, I was still really just trying to figure things out. I had a number of internships and clerkships. Was lucky enough to land a legal clerkship with the Department of Commerce, with their legal team. The Department of Commerce regulates a bunch of different industries, from insurance to healthcare to energy. And my legal clerkship actually did provide me a lot of exposure to to the energy team. So a number of my projects, even being within the legal division, were energy related. I think one of the big projects I got to work on during my time at Commerce was doing legal and policy research around Minnesota's emerging community solar garden program, which I later learned was one of the main, landmark bills that Fresh Energy has helped pass over the last, 15, 20 years. So that was super exciting to kind of see, the inside perspective of that, that law and that rulemaking. And then later learn that Fresh Energy was a huge architect of that bill at the legislature. So back from that tangent, in my third year of law school, I was still kind of trying to figure out I've got this clerkship. I'm enjoying, this work, but I'm still not totally sure that, this track that I'm on is for me. I wasn't, totally enthused about the idea of practicing law all day, every day. The idea of billable hours kind of made me sick to my stomach. So I decided, I really just wanted to kind of network, see what other options were out there. And I was fortunate to be introduced to Michael Noble, our Fresh Energy's executive director, about halfway through, my third year of law school. And it just so happened that Fresh Energy was, going to be hiring again sometime soon, and needed someone to work on energy efficiency in affordable housing, and Fresh Energy's kind of policy and program work there. So one thing led to another, and right out of law school, I was able to start at Fresh Energy, really just working on that one project, energy efficiency and affordable housing. And over time, my portfolio grew over, the next year or two at Fresh Energy, working on issues of solar access. I think the energy efficiency portfolio kind of grew beyond just affordable housing to include other types of rental housing and lower income households. And I think we kind of eventually realized there's a bigger kind of perspective here. There's a bigger set of issues that we're really working on, and it comes down to access and equity. And so that, I think over time, I like to think that our worldview around the issues that we were working on really grew to encompass all of our work. And so I think I would say that my kind of journey in this work was really, at first policy focused. It was really focused on how are we moving the needle on clean energy policy in Minnesota. And I think what I maybe didn't realize at the time was what drew me to law school, what drew me to the issues that I was working on were those justice elements that Janiece talked about. And so maybe it was more implicit, but I think there was always this kind of interest in, all right, what are we doing around really elevating communities that have historically been underserved or marginalized? How are we really, bringing those pieces to the table? And so I'm just really grateful that over the last few years, Fresh Energy has really intentionally stepped into that part of the conversation too. And as Janiece said, 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago now, we introduced our Energy Access and Equity program. Janiece came on board, and I think we've really just leaned in with our full selves into that conversation. So I'm really excited to share more about kind of our journey and evolution. But thank you all for kind of letting Janiece and me share a little bit more about our individual journeys into this work. So to that point on the next slide, I think we can kind of start by talking about what we mean by equity, and then some of the kind of supporting information behind this definition. So really just to kind of level set off this from the start, what we mean when we talk about equity in the spaces that we work in with decision makers, with our partners, is it really comes down to both the process and the outcome. So equity, it refers to the elimination of barriers to full participation in the process and access to the full benefits of the outcome. And I think that as a policy organization, this is critically important for us to keep in mind because, we always, well, I shouldn't say always, but we often think about, what's at the end of the policy or the law that we're passing. How are we getting to 100% carbon-free energy, or how are we increasing the megawatts of solar on the grid? And it's important to think about who is involved in that outcome, but it's also important to think about who's at the table in the process as that bill is developed, as that law is being passed. And I think without both of those components, without really fully thinking about the equation, we're missing a huge opportunity, and we're also risking unintended consequences. And so it's important to think about this full definition in our work. And so I just, I often try to level set with this definition right off the bat. So on the next slide, I think we just wanted to share these graphics from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And this shows that, under-resourced communities, renters, communities of color are disproportionately exposed to higher levels of air pollution. So the left diagram shows the aggregate relative risk level compared to the statewide average, separated by a number of identifiers. And the right diagram shows the proportion of communities that are likely to live near higher levels of air pollution. And this is above PCA's risk guidelines. Strikingly, that's 46% of under-resourced communities and 91% of communities of color. On the next slide, this map shows PCA's areas of concern for environmental justice. You'll notice that these are all statewide. So it's not an urban problem or a greater Minnesota problem. It's really a statewide issue. And so this highlights federally recognized tribal lands, areas with a substantial portion of under-resourced households, and communities of color. And on the next slide, I wanted to introduce a term, or at least resurface a term some of you might be familiar with, and this is energy burden. And this is a critically important metric in our equity work around energy and energy efficiency. This is increasingly common and familiar for a lot of folks, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, energy burden refers to the proportion of a household's income that goes toward energy costs. So it's really how much of your income you're paying toward your energy bills on a monthly or annual basis. So on the next slide, you'll kind of see just a statewide picture of what energy burden looks like. I typically refer to a manageable energy burden or a common energy burden for most households. It's about 2 to 3% of your household income. But you'll see it's a little bit hard to see with some of the fine prints on this particular diagram. But some counties in Minnesota have an average energy burden of upwards of 12 or 13%. So that's striking. That's just energy costs, not factoring in other essentials like food, transportation, healthcare, et cetera. And we know from other research done by Roger Colton and other experts in this field that for the lowest income households in Minnesota, their energy burden can exceed 33%. So that's 33%, a third of household income just going to energy costs every month. Again, not factoring in other essentials. So this is a real problem and something that we need to factor in to our work and really be thinking actively about that in the policy and program decisions that we're making. And I think we can click to the next slide. And I just wanted to include this as well. Again, another very involved slide, but I tried to kind of box out the relevant information here. Again, related to energy burden, I think it's important to consider not just income level in households, but the housing type and whether someone owns or rents their home is a major factor in energy burden and energy affordability as well. So if you look at the far right column on this table, again, this is very involved, but just to pull out, energy burden for renters is typically higher than energy burden for homeowners. And this is, I think, again, critically important to keep in mind, especially when you consider that as a renter, you often don't have the ability to make decisions on energy investments in your home. So renters often live in older housing stock, often less efficient housing, and at the same time, they're maybe less able to upgrade certain lighting or heating in their home, or they're not able to put solar on their roof. They might not own the building and aren't able to go solar. And so these are all factors to keep in mind when it relates to energy burden. Another kind of phenomenon that we see in rental households specifically is something called the split incentive. And that is when, if a renter pays the bills, the building owner is less motivated to invest in energy efficiency because they're not the one seeing, the direct bill savings. Or if a building owner pays the bills, a renter might be less motivated to conserve energy because they're not seeing they're not seeing, where that savings goes. So things like, lack of ability to invest, split incentive, these are, unique considerations and barriers in rental households specifically. And I think that's really informed Fresh Energy's work on leaning into working on affordable housing, rental properties, et cetera, and really trying to increase energy efficiency in particular in those properties too. So on the next slide, I think this is where Janiece and I will kind of run through some, specific program accomplishments. Janiece, do you want me to start on this one, or would you prefer to dig in? Cool. I'll start as long as I'm unmuted here. So we just wanted to share with you all some kind of selected achievements from our program specifically. And I think this is both to just kind of elevate, specific work that we've done around access and equity, but also just to give a little bit of a flavor of, the outcomes and deliverables that we have as a policy organization, and how, the work that we've talked about thus far has really, translated to specific outcomes, frankly, in the real world. So I think just a couple that I wanted to touch on right off the bat, and I think, Janiece, feel free to add ones that I don't touch on. Kind of flowing naturally from what we were just talking about around energy burden and energy affordability. A lot of our work, especially over the last couple of years, has really been focused on really significantly increasing utility investments in energy efficiency programs, serving multifamily buildings, rental properties, and under-resourced households. So just a couple to call out, in that category. First, we were able to work with Xcel Energy and encourage them to commit to increasing their low-income energy efficiency spending. So the amount of money that they're using to fund energy efficiency programs serving under-resourced households by twofold. So over the next 3-year period, they'll be doubling their budget for low-income programs. Relatedly, Minnesota Power, which is an investor-owned utility that serves Duluth and much of the Arrowhead area, is actually for the first time going to be introducing energy efficiency programs for multifamily buildings specifically. And this is a huge accomplishment. There's a lot of rental properties, especially in Duluth. And so having dedicated programs that serve multifamily buildings, just given the kind of unique rental barriers that we talked about a little bit earlier, is a really big step. And we're very excited to see that as well. I think the last thing that I'll mention here before turning over to Janiece, a recent development in our work this year has really been focusing intentionally on the risks and potential outcomes of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen the economic downturn, and we're aware that many residential households in particular are struggling economically during this time. And so consumer protections hasn't historically been a huge part of Fresh Energy's work, but we realized a need to really, be involved in the decision-making spaces that we work in, like the legislature and the Public Utilities Commission, and make sure that residential customers in particular are not at risk of having their service being disconnected during this time. So we were successful earlier this year in advocating at the Public Utilities Commission for utilities to not disconnect customers, to really make sure that folks who have previously been disconnected are safely reconnected, and that utilities are working with customers to maintain payment arrangements during this time to the extent that they're able to pay. So, I think that's been an emergent part of our work, and for as long as this pandemic and recovery period continues, we're committed to making sure that that customers are able to safely maintain service during this time. So, Janiece, I'll let you jump back in with any accomplishments and achievements that you'd like to highlight here.
For sure. No, thank you, Ben. It's really great to have that walkthrough both with the data and to show that there are outcomes that that keep kind of propelling us in this direction. One of the things that I'll call out here, of course, is around developing and strengthening relationships, both with renters and housing justice organizations. That alludes to one of the pieces in my intro that was read about a partnership with Community Stabilization Project, which is a housing rights and housing justice organization in St. Paul. And I think one of the great things about the partnership that we worked on was trying to shifting narrative, shifting the way that we talk about housing and energy, and both those things combined being an environmental justice issue and being something that has to be a part of climate justice solutions. But one of the things we talked about, part of that kind of long name of property dweller, property owner, comes from shifting the language from landlord and tenant or renter to really focusing on the mutual, as we call the mutual asset, which is the home or the property. So being able to say property dwellers for the folks who may be renting, but of course this is their home, right? Like that, just because you're a renter doesn't mean that your space is no less your home than for the person who actually owns it. And so what we're really trying to get at with that is understanding the power dynamic between property owners and property dwellers, and to again have this vision of the shared asset for the home, so that we can try to get at some of those issues that Ben spoke to around like the split incentive, right? Or property dwellers being able to take advantage of energy efficiency upgrades and options, and to hopefully be able to have a better conversation, or at least have a better platform to have a conversation around energy efficiency, and that being a mutual benefit for all parties. And so that was something that came out of really intentional relationship building, coalition building, really building trust and building understanding between two organizations that on paper might not look like they have similar interests, but of course they do. Similar interests and similar passions around making sure that all people have access to affordable, renewable energy, and really trying to push forward energy efficiency and push forward that accessibility towards it. And so, yeah, I just really wanted to highlight that partnership with CSP. It also coalition building is a really important piece of Fresh Energy's work as well. The kind of second line there of Metro Transit's launches new electric bus service on the C line. So we are part of a coalition called Coalition for Clean Transportation that was really instrumental in pushing Metro Transit to make a commitment to procuring and running more electric buses, and certainly for those electric buses to be focused in communities of color that are more overburdened by air pollution, like the map showed, and part of the data that Ben was walking us through. So, but a lot of these, I imagine, maybe even all of them, there's a way to say how coalition building was really instrumental in getting these wins, because of course we can't do this work in silos and do this work alone. So that's a really important piece of how we do our work. And last thing I'll say about the way that we've responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. Another piece of our work has been in between another colleague of ours, Anna Johnson, and myself. We've been working on trying to understand what the kind of landscape is for businesses and organizations who were deeply impacted both by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also by the racial justice uprisings that happened over the summer this year. And so really trying to understand how can energy and public health and climate resiliency strategies be a part of the conversation around recovery and rebuilding, both from this pandemic and from the uprisings that we all witnessed this year. So that is very emerging work, and will be continued through as we're able to kind of figure out how we have an appropriate level of this conversation, and how Fresh Energy can contribute to the recovery work. But I think that's just another really incredible way and important way that we have at this Fresh Energy overall is seeking to respond and to be proactive and following activism, and following that those were both extremely disruptive, right? But like flashpoint moments for all of us to really think deeply and evaluate what are we really doing to address racial injustice, to address an extreme health crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, knowing that these things don't operate in a silo, like they are all connected. The pandemic is a part of the climate crisis that we're all facing. And so we have to, again, think about these things holistically and in a comprehensive way. And that Fresh Energy, that's what's going to take some deep reflection and evaluation. We'll continue to do that. I think we can move on to the next slide.
Great. So we've talked about the outcomes, I think in detail, and the other part of the equity definition now that we wanted to touch on, and I'll be brief here before turning it back to Janiece, is the process. And equity does really require an inclusive and participatory process to ensure that these solutions work for everyone. I think part of what we're still kind of trying to figure out organizationally is, how are we measuring success? How are we thinking about the process, really feeding through to the outcomes that we want to see from the outset. And so part of, I think, this inclusive participatory process has to be, how are we measuring where the benefits accrue, and really what are we defining as benefits in the first place? There's been, I think, a lot of discussion, historically in Minnesota around, things like cost effectiveness, really making sure that investments in energy efficiency, for example, have, a certain threshold of payback. Well, we know that, investments in under-resourced programs serving lower income households, have a harder time meeting that cost effectiveness threshold, because typically it can be more expensive to reach those households. Oftentimes they don't have the upfront capital to invest in energy efficiency, as we talked about. So that means that utilities are spending more upfront to give those, to deliver those energy efficiency improvements to those households. So, that measure of benefit is a barrier in itself. I think it's important to think about, again, these metrics and how we're defining them, how we're measuring them. I'll just briefly mention this photo here is me and Lee Lucas from CSP. He's one of their staff, and this is a visit to his rental property a couple of years ago now. But this was really just an opportunity to experience a little bit more of Lee's own experience in his rental building, some of the challenges, barriers that he was facing, and he was. This was briefly before a meeting with his renters council. So Lee was organizing with other renters in his building to identify things that they wanted to raise to their property owner, and just to talk a little bit more about how to co-create solutions together. So we can shift to the next slide, and I'll be really brief here. I just wanted to share this one example. It's called the Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership. It's from Facilitating Power and the Movement Strategy Center. And if you're interested, I'm definitely happy to share a copy of this full report, or it's, I think, easily accessible online. But this is one potential framework for really more robust community engagement. And I think what I would describe as a more equitable and inclusive process. I think just to briefly touch on this, oftentimes in our work, I think historically we've been guilty of saying, let's get input from this group, for example, or we come up with what we think is a great idea and say, I'll touch base with so and so for feedback. Looking at this spectrum, what I want to call out is, while we have the best intentions in doing that and kind of soliciting some of that input and feedback, at best it's really kind of marginalizing or tokenizing those voices, and it's not really the robust, inclusive feedback and process that we think we're encouraging. And so, I think what we, at least what I, and I think Janiece would say this too, what I think we're hoping to move toward is, more the right side of that spectrum, working more toward delegated power, working more toward community ownership, and really, I think ceding some of our power and our privilege in this work, and bringing in marginalized voices, bringing in underrepresented voices as much as we can from the outset. And that takes time. And, I think, quite frankly, we're not there yet. We will have missteps, but I think that's really what, we're aspiring to when we talk about a more equitable process. So I think we can move to the next slide, and Janiece will dig into some of this a little bit deeper.
Yeah, that's great. So again, coalition building, coalition engagement is a key piece to, I think, Fresh Energy's identity of, how Fresh Energy became an organization. There's actually a great piece to our history of how Fresh Energy formed by partnership building and coalition building. But these are kind of four key buckets for me that when I think of coalition engagement and being able to build those relationships to be able to get to that place of community ownership that we're striving towards, that Ben was talking about in the last slide. It takes, like I said, takes time, and it takes a lot of, give and take. So relationship building is I think first and foremost, right? We have to build trust with one another and build relationships with each other, and that's like both at an individual level, but also at an organizational level. Again, Fresh Energy like organizationally works a lot in coalition, but that takes all of us staff, and I think we have some of our colleagues on the call. I saw J. Hamilton's name on the Zoom call earlier, her title anyway, calling that out because a lot of us work in coalition spaces and in a myriad of different ways, whether it's programmatic and policy work, but also even I think on our operations side, we're always seeking opportunities to collaborate and build relationship with other organizations and just kind of the whole network of our environmental, energy, climate sphere, and I suppose even outside of that, like with the university. So that's really important. And again, none of us can do this work alone, and we all bring certain skills and expertise and resources to the table. So and we need all that. I mean, that's really just how movements work as well. So to really again think about the way that we can follow the lead of activism, follow the lead of movements. It is never, as much as some narratives may lead you to believe, but it's never just about that one person, right? Like movements are made up of hundreds of thousands of people coming together, and we have to be, I think, really clear-eyed about that it's not just the one charismatic leader. It takes all of us to be in it, and so we have to build coalitions together. And so how do we do that? Crafting shared goals is one of those ways. We all kind of have like our lane, and renewable energy policy expertise. That is Fresh Energy's lane. That is what we do best. It's our bread and butter. But we have to all be like kind of in alignment and like working toward the shared goal. And just because that's our lane, that doesn't mean that it is. But we have to be aligned and working in tandem with folks who work on water, with folks who work on transportation, folks who work on housing, right? Like we have to all kind of like have be working towards a shared goal together, and to really also have the understanding of what is that shared goal, what is that shared vision that we're working towards. I hope all of us would say environmental, racial, climate justice, solving our climate crisis, right? Like that is the large scale or bigger picture. But having some shared goals about how we get there is also really important. So the strategies and the methods and the tactics of the ways that we get there fits into this need of crafting a shared goal. And again, having the understanding of where we're all going to be taking up the roles that we have. And because we do that, because when we do that, when we have shared goals, crafted shared goals together, we're building collective power. Again, it takes all of us in this movement to be in it together, because that's what it's going to take. I mean, I hope you can point to any movement, any really huge shifts and changes and gains in our collective humanities timeline. It took building collective power, and that is not just on the political end, but of course including that, but it also it's within our academic spaces, right? It's within our workspaces, it's within the places where we play and pray, right? Like this is about society. This is about building collective power on a long term and like broad reaching way, so that again, wherever you are and whatever you do, you're building that power together and moving to that shared vision. And so sharing resources and privilege is really important for how we get there together. Fresh Energy is a very, what we say, like well-resourced organization, fortunately. And so we have a lot of different relationships and a lot of different ways we have kind of proximity to power. So we have privilege in that. And so being able to recognize how are we going to be a good partner, a good organizational partner, a good partner to the movement? Well, we have to share those resources and share those places of privilege, and also like recognize and understand where those places and points of privilege are. That's not exactly helpful to just say, well, we have, access to funders. So like, we know that we have funding streams that are going to serve us. Well, okay, but what is that? How can you open that door up to folks who do not have that same kind of access? We know that environmental justice work does not get funded to the same levels that kind of like traditional or nonprofit environmental projects have been viewed by the philanthropic community. It is actually extremely extremely abysmal, the amount of funding that environmental justice funding receives compared to traditional conservation type environmental work. And so that's a really important thing to understand, and to try to like break that down of like there are many different ways to get to, again, the shared vision that we have towards solving our climate crisis, and everything is valid. And so trying to do this coalition engagement work and building partnerships is important thing to say is like, well, we an organization that like gets a lot of good funding, just use this one example, we have to be open to talking about that with our funders, and understanding what kind of ways we can share our resources and share our privilege, and to, again, be really conscious and mindful that that is something that is necessary. Otherwise, a lot of projects and leaders go underfunded, unsupported, and we're missing out on so much expertise and so much leadership when we leave folks behind. So yeah, those are all really, again, I think really vital things that come to learn during doing coalition engagement work. And again, with the real intention of following activism and being a good actor in the movement. These are things that we, again, are actively working on. It's not to say that we have done all these things and we have that they're boxes to be checked. In fact, quite the opposite, right? It's always something to be working on and to be reflective about. So we can go on to the next slide.
Great,
Yeah.
Thanks, Janiece. Yeah, so I think just to do a quick time check, we want to make sure that we have some time for questions from you all. So I think I'll just try to briefly cover this slide in 30 seconds or so, and then Janiece, maybe if you want to take a minute on the next one, and then we can move to wrap up. But I think we really just wanted to highlight, we've talked about our external work, and I think that's of course important. It's what the world sees of the work that we're doing, but we also really wanted to highlight that it's important to do internal work too. And so some of this information is on our website. I definitely encourage folks to browse around if you're interested, or Janiece and I would be happy to follow up offline. But Fresh Energy has an internal diversity, equity, and inclusion effort. We have a staff-led committee. It's actually about half of our staff that are part of the committee, so that's awesome. The diagram on the left is kind of our self-administered survey around our diversity that we had on staff when it was delivered, I believe, back in April of this year. So we really intend to, track and kind of re-administer this survey annually, and really just get a sense of who we are and how we're doing on our own diversity and inclusion journey. The other thing that I'll mention before turning over to Janiece to take us home here is, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd earlier this year, as I mentioned, Fresh Energy is proud of the equity work that we're doing, as well as the internal diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we're doing. But we also recognized a need to, I think, frankly, lean further into anti-racism. And it's not enough to just, work only on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and kind of remain silent on systemic racism, the structures of oppression that exist in the places that we work and play, as Janiece said. It's really important to recognize that it goes deeper than DEI, and that we really need to think about how we organizationally are leaning into that as well. And so we, I think, are still exploring how to further those efforts, but we're committed to working on anti-racism as well as our historical DEI work as well. So Janiece, I'll turn it over to you to kind of take us home here, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, next slide. Thank you, Ben. Right, so the kind of quickly, our internal commitments and the things that we've been able to do inside the organization, again, to be able to exude it on the outside. We have a couple staff committees where we do a lot of deep reflective learning. So our diversity, equity, inclusion committee that Ben mentioned. We also have a women's trans femme committee that we started back in the spring of this year, again, to really start to talk about deeply the issues of gender and sexual identity, and to be able to like understand that like sexism and misogyny and patriarchy are just not just forms of oppression, but like it seeps into everything we do, and even if we are trying to be as mindful and conscious about being anti-sexist, right? I mean, it's not enough to just say that we understand that those barriers exist. We have to actively be rooting them out of our organization and out of the society as a whole. So we have a women's trans femme group that many of our staff are part of. And we also have a wellness committee that is really geared around kind of like our organizational culture and just making sure that we are all staying connected, especially in this time right now where we at Fresh Energy are all working from home. So having to be virtual. So how do we stay connected with each other and to keep ourselves whole in this time? And then we have some organizational goals that we have been able to start to implement some of these imperatives around equity. So we did a strategic plan refresh. So we did some good updates to our mission, vision, and values, and our imperatives that are to be very explicit about ambition, equity, and justice. So like how ambitious and bold are we being with our proposals for climate justice solutions and our energy policies that we're advocating for? They have to be ambitious as well as be rooted in equity and justice. And we had an equity strategic action plan that we worked with a consultant on that was focused on evaluating our budget priorities and co-creating our office space. So we have been in the process of designing a new office space. Of course, as everything was disrupted with the pandemic, that was as well. But it's been to be focused on a really good process of co-creation with the entire staff to make sure that we are being as considerate and thoughtful as possible while designing our new office space. That will also, hopefully be really open to the public too. That's part of the goal. But when we all get there again, to gather in person again. And then lastly, like intentional board and staff recruitment to elevate experiences and perspectives. I added this one because I feel like myself was a very intentional hire when this program was created and the position opened up for my position as Ben became the director. It was really to have a focus on, again, this equity work and to take to be really like dedicated to this work and to really throw in us resources and just again really important intention to see this work expand and deepen and stretch across the organization. And so we have quite a few good examples of how we've been able to expand our board and deepen the expertise on our board, but also within our staff. And this is also a good opportunity to mention that we're hiring. Actually, you should have threw the slide in there. Maybe we can drop a link in the chat. But we are hiring for our program team, so you can come join Ben and I in doing this work. But Fresh Energy is hiring, and we just really want to be thoughtful and open up the opportunity to gain more expertise on our staff around diversity, equity, inclusion, and energy work, of course. So I'll stop there since we're at 5 minutes to quickly answer some questions if folks have questions. But thank you very much for inviting us to give this presentation and talk a bit about our work. Thank you.
Okay, so if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll read them off if that's easier. Or feel free to unmute yourself too and go ahead and read your question out loud. And if nobody wants to jump in right now, I'll start us off with one.
Mhm.
So to either of you, do you see any historical missteps with the climate change movement due to not sufficiently evaluating issues with a strong equity and racial justice lens? And also, do you see that changing and some improvements being made in more recent times from your experience?
Yeah, I can start quickly since I'm off mute. Yes, one of the missteps. There's many missteps. I like to think of kind of the way that the environmental movement has been kind of portrayed in this country anyway, as a movement around, being able to be a consumer, right? Like in like green, like being a green consumer. To that focus of, if you just buy the green label thing or the organic thing or what have you, like then you are an environmentalist. I have really strong feelings about that of how problematic that is. Obviously there's the economic component that not everybody can just afford the green label thing or the organic thing, especially when they generally happen to be much more expensive on the retail side than other options. And I just think that it puts a mindset on people that, well, if I can't afford that, then I guess I'm not a good enough environmentalist. And I just think that's really wrong. There's many ways to be an environmentalist. And of course, again, like the lack of understanding around race and class and gender, with that kind of being like the only option. It's extremely short-sighted and extremely narrow, and especially when you don't take into account the myriad of ways that cultures and communities have been extremely self-sufficient and resourceful and focused on like zero waste strategies that don't get the glossy image of being green. So to me, that it feels like self-sabotage that the environmental movement has done to itself. And yeah, I have strong feelings about a lot about that, but I'll let Ben respond as well. You're on mute.
Thanks, Janiece. Sorry, I'm multitasking with the
Yes,
chat
you
here.
are.
So I'll just briefly say an example from our energy policy work. Minnesota's Community Solar Garden program was, I think, initially conceived to be an option for anyone to go solar, regardless of whether you owned your roof or had the money to had the upfront capital to go solar. It was really intended to be, kind of an anyone can access solar type of model. And I think I'll just quickly say about a year or two after the program launched in 2015, there were, I think, some concerns from regulators, from the public around residential customers, and in particular under-resourced customers not being able to actually access the community solar program. Often, financiers who were financing these projects were looking for customers with higher credit scores, which lower income households typically don't have. So they were being shut out of this market completely, despite the fact that the market was intended to be accessible to those customers. So I think that is, in my mind, one of the kind of flagship examples of, policy not totally, turning out to be what we intended to be. So, I think to your question, David, I think the more that those of us who are working in these decision-making spaces have come to start thinking about those unintended consequences. We've, started to think more from the outset. What are the risks here? What are, the potentially negative implications of a policy we might be advocating for? I think those risks are starting to frankly to soften a little bit. And I'm not, not saying that we are getting everything right, that we're perfect in this. But, I think more and more we're seeing policy organizations starting to anticipate where are those consequences going to be? How can we really center equity from the outset? And, I think that's, a relatively recent lesson learned, but I think that is an important lesson. And, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Awesome, thanks. All right, well, I guess we're right about time. If anybody wants to follow up,
Yes.
I think it's really easy to find information. Just Google Fresh Energy and names, and check out their platforms for the legislative session as Sage asked for. Thanks, Sage.
Thank you.
And I want to really thank both of you a lot for joining us this week. It was an awesome presentation.
Oh.
And take care.
Thank you so much for having us, David, and
Thank you,
the
everyone.
invitation. Yeah, thank you all
All right.
tuning
Bye.
in.